All right, well, we have a full slate, so I'm going to get started. We have a great group already. I'm very glad to see you all here. Thank you very much. We'll have more people join us, but I'm going to go ahead and get a few things out of the way. First of all, thank you all very much for spending an hour of your time with us today. We're talking about online research, essential ideas for inclusive outcome. As you all know, we have an idea council. So the use of the term idea is intentional inclusion, diversity, equity, and access that matters in our profession, and it matters in our product and our research. I'm really excited to be talking about that today. We have a sponsor for our Q2 webinars, and this quarter it is InnovateMR. We are very, very grateful to InnovateMR for their partnership on this series in Q2. We'll be hearing more from them in our next town hall. But we're excited that InnovateMR has partnered with us and helped us promote these, and is a fantastic partner to the association and member. So thank you very much to InnovateMR. I know that some of you will be asking if we'll be recording this session, and if we will record it, and we will also transcribe it. So I'd like to take a moment to thank Focus Forward, our transcription partner, for transcribing these for us. When they're completed, they'll be on the website and available for you to download and listen to or read. We have 4 fantastic speakers today. We have Michaela Mora. Michaela Mora is the owner of Relevant Insights and has been the owner since 2007. She has extensive international research in consumer-facing industries. She's going to speak with us today about the consumer side of inclusion in online research. She'll be followed by Dinaz Jawani. Dinaz is the founder of Work Refined. Dinaz is going to follow up on the comments made by Michaela and talk to us about online research as it relates to employees and the employee base and important considerations there. Next up, we have Scott Hansen, Director, Master of Science in Marketing at the University of Texas at Arlington. Scott is going to talk to us about methodology and talk a little bit about sampling, as well as considerations in AI and machine learning. So those 3 are going to flow really well together. And then our final important speaker is Delphine Lomax Taylor, Principal of B&L Research and Consulting. Delphine and I are going to have a really great conversation about some practical research that they're doing today, some really great takeaways for you to take back to your desk. And so thank you to each of our speakers. This is actually the beginning of our first presenter, Michaela Mora. Michaela, off to you.
Thank you, Melanie and InnovateMR, for the opportunity to speak today. Hello, everybody. My name is Michaela Mora. I am the president of Relevant Insights, a research agency in the Dallas area, Texas. We have been doing qualitative and quantitative research and UX research for the last 13 years. I'm also one of the founding members of the Multicultural Insights Collective, a coalition of researchers with experience in research, diversity, and multicultural research. Today, I'll talk about key moments in the evolution of the race categories that we all use today in our surveys, and the challenges we are facing to capture the racial and cultural diversity that has been growing steadily for more than 50 years in the US. I will also touch on the current state of questions related to gender identity and sexual orientation, since this is an area that needs rethinking given the public discourse and changes in attitudes, especially in the younger generations. Then I'll close my section with some practical survey design recommendations. Next slide, please. Most market research surveys use a set of standard categories to measure race and ethnicity. To understand why we use those categories, it helps to know a little bit about their history and the census, because that's where they come from. I strongly recommend reading the book, What is Your Race? By Kenneth Pruitt. He is a professor in social affairs at Columbia and was the director of the census between 1998 and 2001. And he does a great job at showing the evolution of what he calls statistical races at the census in the context of social, economic, and cultural changes in the United States. His thesis is that racial categories that we use today are not accidents of history. They have been constructed by the government and used with political purposes and policy consequences. It is a long history of 230 years and 24 censuses with many changes, reflecting and shaping our social reality. I created this timeline to show changes specifically related to the race categories. I won't have time to go through all of them, so I really recommend reading the book. But race categories we have today have been molded by initially a racist system promoting segregation, hierarchy, and restriction of interracial unions, and then started to take the current form under the influence of the civil rights movement, which changed the purpose of these categories as they became useful when the government began to enact policies to promote integration and equality. And although these categories started with a color line to separate blacks and whites, the immigration of workers who were needed to grow the country introduced the nativity line in the racial categories very early on, and this nativity line continues to play a big role in their definitions today. There are other factors that have shaped the racial categories, such as identity politics, the interest in gaining recognitions by certain groups, and demographics and attitudinal changes towards diversity over time. One important moment in the history of the race categories was the standardization that took place in 1977 across federal agencies. Next. So these are the categories that were used in the 1980 census. I want to draw your attention to the mix of criteria on the left column that were used and are still with us today. The standardization didn't mean a coherent set of categories. So depending on the group, race could mean color, descent group, culture, tribal affiliation, or nationality. They were modified mainly to make public and official how affirmative action should extend beyond Black Americans. And so the term people of color became a common label to refer to non-white groups, indicating greater diversity. Next. As you can see in the most recent 2020 census, all those mixed criteria were still there. Another pivotal change towards measurement of diversity happened in the 2000 census, where the racial categories became a multiple choice question with the Mark 1 or more races, which has been the question format since then. Next. We can see it in the 2020 census there. However, the most significant change in the 2020 was the increased focus on the nativity line. Here you see the census started to ask about the origins for the white and black categories, and there are also more examples of nationalities for other categories. It is important to understand that racial and ethnic self-identification, which is what we ask in the census and in our surveys, is highly personal and can change as one's relationship with our own identity changes. So by focusing on nationality and country of origin, the census seems to be trying to put some distance from the color line and find a way to promote a post-racial society that is based on our geographic origins while reflecting the changes in the population. Next. If you check the definition of each category here on the right column, you can see the greater focus on nationality or the nativity line as the population has grown mainly thanks to immigration. The personal and evolving nature of racial self-identification influenced by the nativity line is posing big challenges for how we measure race in surveys to represent diversity. I want to show you how this may be affecting the responses from non-racial and ethnic groups in market research surveys. Next. In the case of Asians, back in 2012, the Pew Research Center did a study showing that the Asian or Asian American label didn't resonate with people from countries from the Asian continent. Most people from those countries describe themselves by the country of origin. And as you saw in the census form, there is no Asian American category. They just listed nationalities. So the Asian category is really an aggregate of nationalities. Next. If we look at Hispanics, the Pew Center also found that many don't see a shared culture with other Hispanics in the US, and they are more likely to select some other race in any survey. We all have seen that, and this is because the race categories don't resonate with them either. Like Asians, many Hispanics also describe themselves by the country of origin. At the same time, the Hispanic identity fades with generations, which confirms the impact of country of origin. By the way, if you have been thinking about using Latinx instead of Hispanic or Latino in your surveys, please don't. Only 14% of Hispanics have heard of that label and only 3% use it. You can add it to increase reach among younger Hispanics, but don't use it as a substitute. Next. In the case of Black Americans, recent research by Gallup indicated that most say it doesn't make a difference if they are referred as Blacks or African Americans. However, other research has shown that these terms have different associations for many Black Americans. In qualitative research, the authors of the book What's Black About It found that the term Black is often associated with intimacy and familiarity with each other, while the African American label is preferred for public and formal references. At the same time, Black Hispanics and immigrants from Africa and the Caribbean, a group that has grown and doubled since 2000, doesn't often feel represented by the term African American. So again, nationality seems to be having more weight, given the term African in the label. As you can see, the diversity within the established racial and ethnic groups as we know them is growing mainly in connection with immigration. Next. So to conclude this section about racial categories, and before I go to gender and sexual orientation, I wanted to share some practical recommendations to create more inclusive racial categories and analysis in surveys. Please consider not only self-identification, but also nationality, generation, number of years lived in the U.S., education in the U.S., language spoken at home, and other situations, and media consumption. These variables are strongly correlated with racial and ethnic identification. Next. Also, allow for multiple choice. Use several labels to describe a group if there is a fragmentation in their use. Test preferences for labels to avoid being offensive. And if possible, add examples of nationalities and try to analyze by different combinations of race and ethnicity. Next. Now, sex, gender, and sexual orientation. The measurement of these concepts has been studied by federal agencies concerned with the health of and benefits for the LGBT community. There's still many versions out there of how to ask questions about this. The government seems to be the one with the resources to do the research that can help standardize these questions. So I suggest you monitor their work. To ask these questions, we need to consider the definitions of some key terms. Sex is used to refer to biological traits like male and female and intersex. Gender is about the internal sense of gender or belonging to a gender community. So this is about identity. Sexual orientation is more complicated and it has 3 components: sexual attraction, sexual behavior, and also self-identification with an orientation. A big challenge here is to find labels to capture gender diversity and that resonate with most people. There are many labels circulating in the media and social media, but they can mean different things to different people. Even across federal agencies, there are variations on how these questions are asked. Next. Of all the versions I have seen, I like the format recommended by the UCLA Williams Institute of Law. They recommend asking questions separately about gender identity and sexual orientation with clear, common terms and with an option to add your own labels. They also wrote a paper that I recommend reading, explaining the rationale behind their recommendation for the wording and order of these questions. I have not seen that explained for other versions used out there. Next. So here are some practical applications. Don't assume that terms that seem popular, like, for example, non-binary or queer or other, mean the same thing to everybody. So try to use tested and validated terms. This is a very sensitive topic. Please separate gender identity from sexual orientation. They are not the same. Use a sequence of questions. Don't try to compress elements of gender identity and sexual orientation all in one question to save time and money, which tends to create confusion for respondents and confound variables for analysis. Use follow-up open-ended questions when categories are not chosen for so people can write in their own labels. And always include refuse and don't know options to respect privacy and allow for someone who doesn't know how to answer these questions. Next. Well, that's all what I have for you today. But before I finish my section, I want to leave you with some recommended reading about these topics that may help you in your survey design. Thank you. The next one also shows the books about gender or sources about gender. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michaela. We have a question, but I'm going to hold the questions to the end and allow us to move on. But here's another one here. As I mentioned, these slides will be made available, as will the recording, and you'll be able to pick them up there. So now we move on to Dinaj Jawani and EIB employee survey.
Thank you so much for that, Melanie. Greetings, everyone. I am so excited to be here because this is a true win for me. I have been a recovering researcher and of lately a D&I practitioner. So happy to marry both the worlds and lend my insights into a very uncharted and ignored territory, but one in which data collection is really prevalent given all the events of past summer. So if you look at it from a workforce perspective, data collection was always restricted to either getting cursory information about employees, having them just so talent pipelines could be customized, so on and so forth. But with all the backburners issues such as organization culture or diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, all of this since the past year have really come to a forefront. And organizations, big and small, are now finding themselves to really create a solid roadmap and framework through which they can create a sustainable diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives. Now, when we talk about strategy as researchers, we know that it is all rooted in understanding, and seeking perspectives of your employee database, because the classic notion is that once we have an organization that is deeply rooted in this philosophy, all of that eventually translates to other stakeholders such as the consumers, the clients, the investors, the board, depending upon the vertical we are dealing with. So today, my focus is going to be on understanding when we talk about quantitative data collection, and Michaela did a great job of kind of honing in on some of the nuances as it relates to the race and ethnicity question. But when we talk about data collection in a workforce setting, there are some considerations which often get ignored. So let's look at what those are and find some solutions that helps overcome some of those challenges. Next, please. So in a traditional employee data collection framework, the three basic data collection modes are either employee engagement survey that gets administered on a periodic basis. I'm sure most of y'all must have taken it or might be familiar with it. And essentially that is to really understand the sentiment of what employees are feeling in terms of not only how the organization is performing, what their place is, their relationship with the manager. But in addition to that, sometimes depending upon how centralized or decentralized your diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives are, there might be some questions that get thrown into it to kind of get started. Or, it could also mean that depending upon what is the focus of the organization, some specific battery of questions get introduced. The second one is a pulse check survey. And these became really popular since COVID because, of all the physical inhibitions organizations, leaders, managers had, this was a perfect segue to kind of really quickly understand what is like the mental wellness state of the employees. How are they doing? Are there any particular resources that they need? so on and so forth. And then the third one is a diversity specific one in which they are really kind of, customizing their strategy based on some of the vision, mission, values that they might have and want to get a read on where they stand on it to even evaluate and see if that should be a focus. And if that is a focus, how do they phase it out in terms of, the roadmap that they would have over a period of time. Next slide, please. So let's talk about some of the common issues and challenges. So there are some universal ones, of course, like, how do you ask the gender question? How do you ask the race question? Sampling in this particular context is not so much of an issue because usually these surveys get administered to the entire organization in general or a subset of a population if the focus is on leadership, X office, so on and so forth. But the issues over here that really I wanted to focus on was in terms of the context and the background and the implications it has on the way in which you not only ask questions, but the responses you can end up soliciting. Typically based on what the track record of an organization has been in. It has a huge impact on how employees even perceive this entire premise of data collection to be in. Sometimes if they haven't had a solid history of spearheading the diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives in the way they need to, there is a lack of trust in leadership. Most people think it's just a check off and hence the data collection. All of those really kind of, have an impact about, people's willingness to even click on that link to open that survey, right? So the history of addressing past and current issues, the true authenticity and intentionality really kind of, helps employee disposition so as to their willingness to even take the survey and let alone answer it to their full confidence. The second one is, of course, in terms of response rates. If people see the surveys being administered over a period of time and there is a lack of action, it is very clear and logical that they wouldn't be at all invested in furthering, offering their feedback or any other thoughts or suggestions they might have. On an average, for an organization that does a stellar job, you could expect, and who has like a great org culture, they are one of the top 50 or so. The employee sentiments are usually very positive. Even in those environments, engagement surveys usually have a response rate of 30 to 40%. And if your organization is towards the other end of the spectrum, then you can pretty much realize that, this is a very prevalent issue because people don't even have enough responses and enough validity and reliability in the data that they get to help craft the strategy. So survey positioning, leadership influence is really key because depending upon who is sending the survey, I have had numerous clients and studies that very well have elaborated that the voice of the leadership and who ends up sending the survey has a huge impact on not only the response rate, but the type of responses you end up getting. For example, if you have somebody from an HR arm or HR per se sending out a survey, employees' perception about those surveys and survey questions are vastly different if you have somebody from a people and culture arm sending it out. So all of that is to say that unlike in a typical consumer research world, where the challenges are different, when we talk about employee surveys in general, all of these nuances are pretty much a make or break in terms of yielding not only higher response rate, but responses that can further be of any value. Now let's talk about questionnaire design and reporting. And I'm sure my peers will do a great job in honing into specific questions and issues as it relates to, some of the key questions that helps you set the quota, do analysis, so on and so forth. But mostly in the setting when employee questionnaires are either drafted or administered, you typically have somebody from, HR or other section of an organization who's going to use a template or a canned version on some of the platforms and essentially retool it, slap a logo, and send it out. That means everything that I've discussed so far is sometimes barely being put into consideration. And the lack of context and framing sometimes can be a gaslight issue in those contexts. And I particularly say that because if your organization has been combating any issues in terms of incidences where employees have used racial slurs, gender issues haven't been tackled properly, all of that means that, when it comes to sharing their feedback, they have that perception in their background that's highly going to color the way and manner in which they're going to respond to the survey. Language inconsistencies are really common because if people adapt a templated version, that means there is no continuity, the questions haven't been tested. Slight changes, which seem slight, often have a huge impact in terms of the type of data that you end up getting. Data transparency. People always have this notion, oh, well, I answered like a 5-minute long survey, but in terms of what I got shared in terms of our insights were some of the very cursory data points which I have been seeing off and on. And this usually is because based upon the organization's decision to share the amount of information, because all of this is deeply rooted into the state of the organization, the lack of transparency sometimes really all has a bearing effect not only on the response rate, but types of responses you end up yielding as well. Lack of action, like I mentioned before, is one of the prevalent measures in which you end up losing audiences and respondents, and then it just spirals down into getting some data or getting data which is inactionable. Next slide, please. So knowing all of these challenges, what is that you can do or adapt as best practices to make sure that your strategies are aligned and you get at a place there you want to be? Now, identifying the focus is really key too, because just like consumer surveys, clients want all of those points to get integrated within that one questionnaire, and they feel, that is a perfect opportunity to solicit feedback. Similar to that, level setting and honing in on what the focus of the survey needs to be is absolutely critical, because that helps in question framing, contextualizing, and then really creating a process where people walk through this entire journey and have a solid buy-in right from the data collection point to the execution and operationalizing standpoint. So prioritizing the information, having hard conversations in terms of, what that priority model should look like, perhaps considering a phased approach because Rome wasn't conquered in a day. And that kind of mentality and mindset would help to kind of get timely, accurate information that could be put to use. In my experience, I have really thought the 3C model to be working really well, because when you position and come out and justify the intent of data collection, that has a huge impact on employees' perception about what exactly is going to get done with this. And as you prepare for data collection, I often tell my clients, be ready to get in the action mode, because the time lag to sit on a data and the world, external and internal, changing at the pace that it is, there is pretty much no wiggle room to take your own sweet time and put in more than needed effort to sit and roadmap that further. Calibrating the data collection approach is very much needed, because sometimes because of the lack of expertise that people have in-house, the lack of research mindset, the thoroughness, the rigor, the methodology that backs all of this might be absent. And that can prove to be challenging in terms of what do you mean for your ongoing quant data collection efforts. And sometimes, of course, there is a mix of both qual and quant. And that is another discussion for some other day in terms of how you could prioritize and make all of that happen in a succinct fashion. Action and investment. I think I have covered the action piece quite a bit. But one of the typical challenges is really having some of the in-house researcher or external experts kind of look at the data collection entity with an objective mindset to kind of not only help them prioritize what it is, but ask the right questions, tell them what you can get by asking active questions versus what could be tackled analytically, because diversity is a huge spectrum and it's not unidimensional. When we talk about intersectionality, to complicate some of the issues that Michaela dealt with, sometimes it's just not gender and ethnicity. Sometimes it's the intersectionality of both of them. And that could be layered with, your acculturation levels, your number of years in the United States, and all of that. So to kind of help them prep into active data collection questions versus what could analytically be solved is a great way, because the last thing you want to do is ask a multi-tiered questions in terms of, are you a male, Asian, XYZ? And which you will be surprised, you'll not be surprised to see that could happen quite a bit, because if that is one of the pain points the organization is dealing with, it's quite likely that those will get at the forefront. So continuous momentum, monitoring trends, benchmarking are all the aspects that is something that I highly encourage organizations or you all as researchers, if you ever have the opportunity to kind of, work on projects similar to this or kind of triangulate that with what you do in the consumer space, that would be absolutely key. Lastly, I want to thank again for this opportunity and for the research community who have provided a lot of support to the Indian community back home. I know there are some of them on the call from this to help combat some of the crises that the country is currently facing. So a personal thank you to all of you for it. Over to you, Mel.
Dinaz, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Our next speaker is Scott Hansen. Scott, off to you. And Scott, you are on mute.
Yeah, well, most people try to mute me anyway. I have one student in the group. I think I saw Troy, and he's probably already muted me. So, thank you guys. That was, very interesting, helpful stuff already. So when I come in here, I come at it from two students. Thanks, Christina, for keeping me honest. I come in from the instructor perspective with practitioner background. And when I approach these kinds of topics in the methodology courses in the graduate program, I put a great emphasis on trying to generalize your thinking about methodologies so that regardless of the platform you're using, you're asking the same sort of questions, especially when it comes to sampling and bias. So we have, from a sampling perspective, we're all familiar with the SMR 28 questions. Those are sort of the practical application kinds of questions you'd ask about panel management, sample sources, sampling, project management, and so forth. Those are our industry kinds of questions. But I think like a lot of the things that we're encountering these days, I don't know if encountering is the right word, a lot of things that we're reviewing these days, it might be appropriate for us to ask some deeper questions about panel structure, panel composition, recruitment, and all of those things. And it can apply in any aspect of that panel management relationship. So you think about the example I used with my students from a recruitment standpoint that I say applies to panels as well as any other format is if I sent you on campus and asked you to recruit someone, who are the first people you're going to go to? And it's generally people that look like you because we have a familiarity, we have an inherent sort of comfort level, which equals a bias, right? Well, a lot of the ways that we have built panels over the years have been some blend of trying to get a representative sample that is statistically defined and trying to basically build up a substantial sample source that we can do business with people who want information. But panel recruitment is just part of that process, because the management and engagement components then also affect sort of the quality, and I use quality in terms of what is the nature of the composition, not a negative to positive kind of a scaling, but the quality, the nature of the kinds of responses you're going to get there. So if we turn our relationships with our panelists into transactional relationships, then we inherently shallowize the quality of the data that we're going to get from them. So we look at switching from those good practices, the management and engagement, how we're engaging with them, how we're asking those questions. Those kinds of things should be at the top of mind when we're considering a sample source. Move over to that right side, the practical considerations that applies to recruitment methods. So one of my accounts years ago was an outdoor power equipment company, and they were always looking for professional landscape contractors, PLCs, which don't tend to exist in online panels in a meaningful way. And so we started looking at mobile research. We started looking at going to trade shows, because the mentality was, let's go find the people where they are. But that doesn't exactly work either. We can go and recruit those people to be on our panel, but if the panel participation doesn't fit in their lifestyle, fit with who they are, we're not going to get that kind of information. And I think we've all sort of come to terms with this shaky assumption that we've had, that people who participate in panels are not qualitatively and meaningfully different from people who do not participate in panels, because we can't get to people who aren't on panels, so we sort of just whistle past that graveyard, if you will. But then I think we want to ask ourselves, from that recruitment methods, engagement strategies perspective, are we, even if we get those statistics right, are we getting good quality information from all the groups in those panels? And I don't know that we can accept that assumption. We go to surveys because we like standardized question format, but the same question doesn't mean the same thing in different ways. And also, when we're building those samples, those implicit, explicit biases, I told you before, it could be a comfort level if you're in person, but it can also be as we're recruiting, as we're using screening criteria, as we're using pull metrics for our sample, we could be overlooking things that actually have meaningful differences for our sample, because we're not attentive or we're not appreciative of the nature of those differences, which is a prevailing theme in our society these days, that we are not appreciating the impact of these differences. So look back down at that left side. When we're looking at our sample and we're asking, oh, does this race and ethnicity mix match the population? It may match it from a demographic standpoint, but where we're getting that mix of respondents may not be a representation of the attitudes in the population. So we can look at our different sources and we can expand our sources, but we should always be looking at what is our recruitment rate within those. We're all accustomed to rates, it's response rates, take rates, referral rates, all of those things. But when we're looking at those recruitment methods, it could be that that we're getting that demographic mix, but we're pulling them from non-representative segments of the diverse population. And also something that we mentioned on the employee surveys, the response context, right? So if a survey is structured so that it looks appropriate for one group but looks formal or structured to another group, it can affect the kind of information they're willing to provide, right? So if we don't have real credibility with the group, I mean, this is why we hire people who are native speakers, people who are diverse cultural backgrounds, because we know that context matters in the form of a questionnaire, and yet we employ the same format of a questionnaire out of practicality purposes, but for what we would like to have as a diverse population. Somewhere in there, we're going to have to make trade-offs, of course, but I think it all begins really with asking those first basic questions about where are we getting these panelists, how are we engaging with them, and is it a genuine relationship that we have with them that allows us to put, a substantial stock into the responses that we're getting from those. So if you wouldn't mind moving to the next slide. That kind of segues nicely into the social media space, because that is a space that ostensibly and maybe originally was a place where you were supposed to create your own comfortable environment. You cultivate your audiences, your friends groups, you customize your feed, plus ads that are being targeted to you and so forth. And we've been reluctant as a group to take social media at face value because we think, oh, it's just voluntary participation. The only people going on there are the people who are willing to participate in that activity, but so are panels, right? Panels are voluntary participation. And I noticed, maybe about a year ago, I had a client who, I still keep in touch with some clients, called me and was really upset because was told that when purchasing panel sample, that it was now a convenience sample, not a targeted sample in the nomenclature. And she said that that it was coming from that panel company, that we can't force people to respond and so forth. So it was really like a semantics exercise, but it triggered in her this question of, well, if it's a convenience panel or convenience sample, is it then trustworthy? And I was like, well, it's always been a convenient sample and we've always had trust in it, but because we change language, we start to question. And I think that's one of the things that I really try to impart in my students is question assumptions. Don't do it in a way that's cheeky or defiant or critical, but question assumptions. Why are we doing it this way? And I think that we're all a little more open to that now, because when we get to this bias thing, a lot of the panel practices that we've employed has, thank you, Melanie, for correcting my SMR 28 to 37. My students will be happy too. So we start looking at what are they looking to get out of the social media place, individual agendas, groupthink playground, because we can cultivate those. And it's very, very easy and comforting to allow your social media space to become an echo chamber. And I think that people aren't, we get to the cognitive bias chart and everything. I think we just are generally less willing to fight against those things these days, as more willing to maybe just opt out of things than try to change them. Right? Rather than engage in conversation with someone that is different from us, we back off. And I think that has implications for our work as well, because we're asking people questions about things that, maybe not personally relevant or maybe highly personally relevant, but they don't necessarily think you're the person with whom they're comfortable sharing that truth. And then, the active in the social media you can get this group think mentality going, because you start hearing the large bulk of your feedback sounds like you, and so that we know that induces greater confidence, greater investment in our own attitudes, because we're hearing everyone agreeing, and suddenly someone who disagrees is a weirdo. Well, if you're doing survey research and you're asking questions that don't mesh with their perspective, it can affect the way that they are responding. Just the nature of our society these days. And that doesn't even get into the trust matters. There was a really interesting sketch on, I'm one of the handful of people who still watches Saturday Night Live. And a couple of weeks ago, the host was Daniel Kaluuya. And they did a game show format, and he is an African-American physician, and there are 4 contestants that are all extended members of his family. And the only question he's asking them is, will you take the vaccine? And they're all resistant. They're all high-risk categories, diabetic, older adult, questionable lifestyle, whatever. And they're all reluctant to take that medication, even from a relative physician, because of distrust or false, fake news would be the thing, right? And so it's like they're resistant to the logical arguments. That kind of thinking then affects the kind of information that they are going to be willing to share with you. And I think that we just generally get less willing to think deeply about things these days. So asking participants to think deeply on a survey is stretching them. But then if you don't have relevance or credibility in your language, if you don't have the right sample mix from an attitudinal perspective, not just a demographic perspective, you're going to get a misrepresentation in the marketplace. And I think a logical kind of argument back is, but it's been working. It's been working. Why must we revisit this or evolve it? And I would say, well, it's been working because it matches your assumptions, but the question we ask clients all the time is, what if it could get better? What if you could do better than you're doing if you just changed your approach? You're inducing questions about the data. When we look over at those AI or ML approaches, machine learning approaches, we need to remember that those algorithms are built by people, and they start with assumptions that may or may not hold these days. Text analytics, the same sort of thing. Language evolves and authenticity is there. So the Latinx comment from Michaela, that's important. And just looking at the chat and my own reaction, that's information that I didn't have, that other people didn't have. But it's like we want to be relevant, but we don't have the contextualization of the relevance to know, not all of us have a 14-year-old son living with them who will tell him when he is completely out of touch. Okay. So authenticity, social norms, is it appropriate to share with this group or in this context? Personal relevance, do I even care if they know the real thing? It's a lot of things wrapped up in there. And I think we need to ask those questions about the assumptions at the beginning and then engage those that diverse sample that we're talking about in a deeper conversation about, what is the value of this relationship to you in terms of, participating in research? What are we doing wrong? What are we missing? And just sort of embrace our own humble ignorance, if you will, about these topic areas that have existed but haven't been acceptable fodder for an open conversation until recently. And I think that we should all be open to that conversation, set aside those assumptions or those sensitivities that we have about what we've done before. What we are not bound by what we've done before. We reserve the right to get smarter as we go. And that would be kind of asking those deeper questions about your sources as well as your question formats and so forth. And that'll be it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Scott. And for those of you on the call, what I was messaging Scott about is that the SMR 28 has gone through a very recent complete overhaul. It is now called the SMR Online Buyer's Guide. I was on the team that helped rewrite the SMR 28 in totality, content, and context, and it includes even a new set of metrics that can help you understand these and really create a conversation with your partners as you're trying to understand fit for purpose of the sample that you're buying, and specifically inclusion and diversity aspects of it. So if you haven't seen that new online buyer's guide, you'll want to take a look because it's been updated to really think about the technology as well that people use and what biases might be introduced through the technology being used. Really, really cool. And so now I'm really excited to just have a quick conversation with Delphine. I'm going to turn the share off for just a minute so you can just see us. Delphine, thank you very much. And thank you for your patience as we got through the other presentations. I just wanted to ask you a couple of really important questions. First, you were sharing with us earlier this week about some important work that you've been involved in around gender. Could you just walk us through some of that work and some of the things you had to work with your clients on as you're working on gender work?
So, and first of all, I really want to start out by saying excellent panelists. I'm sitting here and I've learned, I was jotting notes. I don't know if you can see me, but I was actually taking notes because I've been in the industry since and I'm telling my age, I guess, since the late 70s. So you're speaking about, we're talking about some important subject matters, race and gender, and I've seen a lot. So lately, matter of fact, I can tell you right now, you don't know what you don't know, and I don't know if you've ever heard that, but I know once you find out something, you can build upon it. We all make mistakes, but we can correct them. And I say that to say, I was going back then when I knew I was going to be on this webinar, I kind of said, well, I need to do a little more research. I need to do some research, and let me look back at some of the things we've done and how did we ask that gender question. And I pulled a survey. It had to do with home buying. And this was just as recent as 2017. And Michela, I said, what is your gender? Male or female? Those were the answers. There were no other category. So you could see right now, we're changing. We're learning that that was their sexual orientation, not necessarily gender. But I'll tell you, even more recently, we still have asked, and I don't think I'm alone in this, we still have kind of asked it that same way. What is your gender? I was just looking at a study. We're just working on a study, and I'll go over a couple of them. And they happen to be women organizations. Just finished a project with an organization. It's an 119-year-old. Now, it's local to the area, but it is a national organization, and they were doing this perception study. We did qualitative work, IDIs, focus groups, but then we followed up with a survey. And so in the demographics section, again, we were talking about gender, and it was so interesting. We expanded it. But again, we were asking that question, what is gender? And our answers were female, male, transgender, bigender, non-binary, prefer not to say. Still did not have an open-ended question. I'm like, duh. I looked at the results, got the results back, Melanie. 94.74% female, 5.2% male. Nobody answered. Everything else was zero. And then so now it makes me think, could we have asked that differently? But I'm not too hard on myself. Number one, we were using, and this is crucial too, because I think, let me make sure, Scott, talking about sampling and database, sampling, this was their database. So I'm not going to be too hard on myself for just asking the question like that, because it was their database. So that was an insight of itself, meaning most of the people in their database were classified themselves as women. And it's true, it was a women's organization. But we do need to take a step closer and be a little bit sensitive about that question. That was just one particular thing that I wanted to say, that the way you ask the gender question, which that's what we've been talking about today, is so very important. Another organization that we've worked with, Melanie, is another organization out of DC, all female organization, older organization, and their goal, here's another thing. When you're asking questions, you also have to know, what is the objective of the research you're working on? What are you trying to get out of the research? And so they're trying to be more diverse, have open up to younger audiences and things like that. So that question, we said, what options best describe your gender identity? Doesn't that sound a little bit better than some of the other things we have been talking about? What is your gender? But describe your gender identity. And then from there, we didn't just say male, female, female/woman, male/man, trans female/trans woman. We began to expand upon the various categories. And again, gender identity, and prefer not to respond. And we also added prefer to self-identify. Very key there. And that actually, after I was doing a little bit more research, sometimes it's best just to have the respondent prefer to let them self-identify. And it's an open-ended question. Sometimes you'll have to code, but sometimes, again, it depends on what's the goal of the research. What are you trying to get at? Most recently, too, just switching gears a little bit, I'm working with a financial company, a financial institution. And so after I was doing all this research about how do you ask that question, that gender question, I brought it up to them and I said, why don't we expand it beyond male, female? And this is the way they word it. Do you consider yourself to be male, female, prefer to self-describe, and prefer not to answer? And then in some cases, we all, and I don't know if we address this, but in some cases, and with this particular client, if you don't answer because they want to stratify this information, you're terminated. So if you're participating in this particular project, you're terminated. But one thing he did said, it's been working for them and that they do self-identify. And one other thing I wanted to answer before closing, or the next question is, but you have to work with your clients. I can do a suggestion, but it's kind of a two-way street. I could tell my client, no, we need to do it this way. And they may say, no, we need to do it this way. So sometimes there's a compromise, or you just have to, and then to be honest with you, sometimes you just do it. And then when it comes back and it's not quite the way they thought, you just sit there and bite your tongue a little bit. And the last thing, and we didn't talk about this, and I know we're talking about online research, but I had an experience moderating the focus group about 2 months ago. This was I don't know why we're doing so much research about females, but I was working with a college, and they sent me the moderator's guide. And the moderator's guide had, let me introduce myself. My name is Delphine Lomax Taylor. My preference pronouns are she, her, and hers. Well, my initial reaction was I struck it after I took out my preferred pronoun. And the client came back to me and said, Delphine, do you have a problem saying that or don't? I've been in the industry since 76. I had never done that before. But did it hurt me? No, because this is how they refer to themselves when they address themselves on campus. So it was okay. And in my focus groups, behind their name, it was their preferred pronoun. So I say that to say things are changing, and we have to be able to move with change.
I love that. Thank you. We're running out of time, but is there any last piece of advice that you'd like to give us? I love the advice we've gotten so far. While we're quantitatively focused today, we need to be qualitatively learning as we go. So I love that, and a constant sense of learning and not being afraid to evolve and to test. But is there anything else just practically working with the clients that you've worked with and the recent work that you've done that you'd like to share with people?
Just the last two things that I've been researching on around race and gender is to only ask the questions if they are needed. That's a good best practice. Sometimes we ask questions for the sake of asking questions. So one of the best practices, even around gender and race, is how are you going to use it? Is it needed? Are you cross-tapping by that? But those are my closing comments. And I do know also in Michela around the race thing, things are starting to change. Matter of fact, you can do a little research on that gender. They're going to start collapsing things. And Michela already talked about Black versus African American. But they're going to, like she said, when you say Black, that's going to encompass so much more: African American, Caribbean, Black. But best practices, just be open and know that things are changed. And we'll have this conversation next year, and it'll even be different.
It's wonderful. Thank you. So thank each of you very much. We don't have much time for questions, and so I'm going to have to end the call today. But I want to encourage everyone, if you want to continue this conversation, the Insights Association is having an idea forum. I'm going to share this screen with you really quickly. Don't drop off before you hear this. We're having an idea forum July 14th through the 15th, and it is going to be 2 days of think tanks. One day will be focused on inclusion, diversity, equity, and access in our profession, how we can have more representative researchers in the room as we're generating insights and designing research. And the second day will be about inclusion, diversity, equity, and access in our product, in our research, in our practice, how we can do better at making great surveys and great questionnaires and great research practices that are inclusive, diverse, and have equity and access for all. Really, it's a learning activity. We don't have a lot of the answers yet, but the industry is moving forward, and this is going to be a think tank 2 days that are really important to us. So I really hope you'll register for that. Thank you all very, very much. And I hope you have a great, great weekend.